I used to believe that betrayal always arrived with a whisper, but I learned that the most dangerous lies are the ones spoken with absolute certainty. The day I decided my wife had betrayed my family, I never asked her for the truth. I only listened to the silence she left behind. For 8 years, that silence became the strongest wall I had ever built. Every morning began the same way. The city stretched beneath the glass walls of my penthouse, while the first rays of sunlight painted the skyline in shades of gold and steel. Thousands of people hurried through their ordinary lives, unaware that one decision made inside my office could change the future of businesses, charities, and families across the city. They called me powerful. They called me untouchable. None of them knew that the one thing I could never control was a memory. My name is Marcus Callahan, and people have spent years believing that nothing could shake my judgment. They were wrong. My house was large enough to echo, even when nobody spoke. Every hallway reminded me that wealth could purchase silence but never comfort. A portrait still hung above the fireplace because I had never allowed anyone to remove it. It showed my parents smiling beside me on the day our family foundation opened its first community center. The empty space beside me had once belonged to Evelyn before I ordered every photograph of her taken down. Every photograph except one. I never admitted that to anyone. The single picture remained locked inside the bottom drawer of my desk, hidden beneath contracts and financial reports that nobody else ever touched. I told myself I kept it as evidence of a mistake. Deep inside, I knew I kept it because I could not erase her completely. Anthony knocked softly before entering my office. He had worked beside my family for decades and rarely looked surprised by anything. "The board meeting starts in 30 minutes, he said calmly. I nodded without lifting my eyes from the paperwork spread across my desk. Business was predictable. Numbers obeyed rules. People did not. As Anthony turned to leave, he paused. The foundation received another letter from Lincoln Elementary. They are asking for support again. I barely looked up. Approve the donation. He hesitated. Would you like to attend this year? I almost laughed. Charity events were for photographs and speeches. I had stopped believing photographs years ago. No, I answered quietly. Send someone else. After he left, the office fell silent again. My gaze drifted toward the locked drawer. For a brief moment, I considered opening it. Instead, I stood and faced the enormous window overlooking the city. Somewhere beyond those streets, Evelyn was living a life that no longer belonged to mine. At least that was the story I had repeated so many times that it sounded like truth. She had disappeared without defending herself. She had never written, never called, never returned. I accepted every accusation because accepting them hurt less than asking why. Regret is a strange companion. It does not shout. It waits patiently until the room grows quiet enough for you to hear it breathing beside you. I did not know it then, but before the week ended, an ordinary school teacher, carrying nothing more than an old photograph, would quietly begin tearing down every certainty I had spent 8 years building. The following afternoon, I found myself sitting in the back seat of a quiet black sedan, instead of inside the conference room where everyone expected me to be. Anthony sat across from me with a leather folder resting on his lap, studying my expression without asking questions. He had known me long enough to recognize when my silence carried more weight than my words. The city rolled past the windows in a blur of brick buildings, coffee shops, neighborhood parks, and school buses. It had been years since I had driven through this part of town. My foundation had supported dozens of schools across the city, yet I had never visited one in person. Numbers on financial reports were easier to manage than grateful faces. They expected generosity. They never expected honesty. Lincoln Elementary looked exactly the way an American neighborhood school should. Children laughed across the playground while colorful murals brightened the brick walls. Teachers greeted parents with warm smiles as students hurried through the front entrance carrying oversized backpacks. Nothing about the place belonged in my world, and perhaps that was exactly why it felt strangely peaceful. The principal welcomed me with genuine appreciation instead of nervous admiration. She thanked the foundation for replacing outdated library shelves and expanding the reading program. I listened politely, offering a few brief responses while my attention wandered toward the classrooms lining the hallway. Framed student artwork covered the walls beside handwritten essays about courage, family, and dreams. Their words carried a sincerity that money could never purchase. As the tour continued, a classroom door opened quietly. A middle-aged teacher stepped into the hallway holding a stack of books against his chest. His hair had turned silver around the temples, and thin reading glasses rested comfortably across his face. He stopped walking the moment he looked at me. His eyes widened with unmistakable recognition. It was not the recognition of someone who had seen my face in the news. It was something older, more personal. He studied me, as though he had been waiting years for this exact moment. The principal smiled politely. "Mr. Harper, this is Marcus Callahan." His foundation made today's library project possible. The teacher barely acknowledged her introduction. His attention never left my face. "Marcus," he said softly, almost to himself, "you still have your mother's eyes." Every sound in the hallway seemed to disappear. Anthony looked toward me, confused. Nobody outside my family had ever spoken those words. Not once in 8 years. I felt my heart beat slow instead of quicken, the way it always did when something impossible entered the room. "Have we met before?" I asked. Daniel Harper lowered the books onto a nearby table with careful hands. "Not exactly," he answered. "But I knew someone who loved talking about you." My thoughts immediately searched for explanations that refused to make sense. My mother had passed away years before Evelyn disappeared. Their worlds had never overlapped with an elementary school teacher, at least not as far as I knew. Daniel reached into a worn leather satchel and gently removed a weathered envelope that looked as though it had been opened and sealed countless times over the years. He held it carefully, almost respectfully, without offering it to me yet. "I promised myself I would only show this to you if our paths ever crossed," he said quietly. Anthony shifted his weight beside me, sensing the tension that had settled over the hallway. I stared at the old envelope, unable to explain why my hands suddenly felt unusually heavy. Daniel looked directly into my eyes before speaking again. "There is something you have believed for a very long time," he said. "I think it is time you finally saw what your wife wanted you to know before she disappeared." For several seconds, I simply stared at the weathered envelope resting in Daniel Harper's hands. The edges had faded with time, and the paper carried the quiet weight of something that had survived years without losing its purpose. I reached for it slowly, almost afraid that touching it would somehow erase the certainty I had lived with for 8 long years. Daniel did not rush me, neither did Anthony. The hallway around us continued with ordinary life. Children laughed somewhere beyond the classroom doors. A bell rang in the distance. Teachers exchanged friendly conversations. It felt strange that the world could remain so ordinary, while mine was beginning to shift beneath my feet. I carefully unfolded the envelope and found a single photograph inside. At first glance, nothing about it seemed extraordinary. It showed my mother standing beneath an old oak tree outside a community center, smiling with the quiet warmth I remembered from childhood. Beside her stood Evelyn, looking several years younger, wearing a simple blue dress and holding a notebook against her chest. My mother rested one hand gently on Evelyn's shoulder. Both women were looking directly into the camera. Both were smiling. Then I noticed something I had never expected to see. My mother was wearing the silver family brooch she never allowed anyone else to touch. Yet in the photograph, she was fastening it onto Evelyn's coat. I could almost hear my mother's voice again. She once told me that the brooch would only be given to someone she trusted with the future of our family. She had never spoken those words lightly. My hands tightened around the photograph as memories surfaced one after another. I remembered the day my mother passed away. I remembered the confusion that followed. I remembered believing that Evelyn had hidden things from me. Every memory now felt as though someone had quietly rearranged the pieces, while I was looking somewhere else. "Where did you get this?" I asked, my voice lower than I intended. Daniel looked toward the photograph before answering. "Your mother visited our school every month during her final year. She volunteered with our reading program because she believed every child deserved someone who would listen. Evelyn came with her almost every time." I looked at him in disbelief. "She never told me that." Daniel nodded gently. "She promised your mother she would not. Your mother wanted those visits to remain private, because she never wanted attention for helping people." I lowered my eyes to the photograph again. Everything Daniel said sounded exactly like my mother. She believed generosity lost its meaning when it became a performance. Anthony quietly stepped closer. "Marcus," he said carefully, "I never knew any of this either." Daniel reached back into his satchel, and removed a small notebook with worn leather covers. He did not hand it to me. Instead, he opened to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "Your mother left this with me shortly before she passed away," he explained. "She asked me to keep it safe until the day I believed you were finally ready to hear the truth." My heartbeat became strangely calm. I had expected anger. Instead, I felt something much heavier. Doubt. Real doubt. The kind that quietly dissolves certainty without making a sound. Daniel closed the notebook again before I could read a single word. "Not today," he said gently. "If you read everything now, you will not believe it. You need to discover why your wife chose silence before these pages will make sense." As I slipped the old photograph back into its envelope, I realized that for the first time in 8 years, I was no longer asking where Evelyn had gone. I was asking whether I had ever truly known the woman I believed had betrayed me at all. The drive back to my office felt longer than any journey I could remember, even though Lincoln Elementary was less than 15 miles from downtown. I never turned on the radio. Anthony respected the silence, watching the city pass through the window, while the old envelope rested on my lap, like it weighed far more than paper ever should. Every traffic light gave me another excuse to look at the photograph again. My mother's smile never changed. Neither did Evelyn's. Yet every time I studied the image, I noticed another small detail I had ignored before. Their hands were close together. The notebook Evelyn carried had my mother's handwriting on the cover. Behind them stood the entrance to the same community center where my family foundation had held its first charity event years before. I had attended that ceremony. I remembered the speeches. I remembered the applause. I did not remember seeing Evelyn there. That frightened me more than the photograph itself. Memory is supposed to become clearer with certainty, but mine suddenly felt like a room filled with mirrors, reflecting pieces instead of truth. The moment I stepped inside my office, I walked directly to the locked drawer beneath my desk. My fingers hesitated over the key before finally turning it. Inside lay the only photograph of Evelyn I had refused to destroy. I placed it beside the one Daniel had given me. The difference between them was impossible to ignore. In the picture I had kept, Evelyn looked exhausted during the final weeks before she disappeared. I had always believed guilt caused the sadness in her eyes. Now I was no longer sure. I leaned closer until I noticed something I had overlooked for years. She was wearing the same silver family brooch my mother had been fastening onto her coat in the older photograph. My breathing slowed. If my mother had personally given Evelyn that brooch, why had nobody ever mentioned it after her death? Why had I never asked? Anthony quietly entered the office carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one beside me before looking down at the photograph spread across my desk. "You have seen something," he said carefully. "I can tell." I nodded without looking away. "Tell me everything you remember about the weeks before my mother died." Anthony frowned, searching through memories almost a decade old. "She became much more private," he answered. "She canceled several public events. She often left without telling anyone where she was going." I looked at him. "Did she ever leave with Evelyn?" He paused. The hesitation lasted only a second, but it was enough. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "Several times." I stared at him in disbelief. "Why did you never tell me?" Anthony lowered his eyes. "Because you never asked. After Evelyn disappeared, you had already decided what happened. Every conversation became about confirming what you believed instead of questioning it." His words landed harder than any accusation ever could. He was right. I had spent years collecting evidence that supported my conclusion, while ignoring everything that challenged it. I reached for my mother's old foundation records stored on a nearby bookshelf. Dust covered the binders, untouched for years. Inside were attendance lists, handwritten notes, volunteer schedules, and donation receipts. Page after page carried my mother's careful handwriting. Evelyn's name appeared again and again beside community projects, reading programs, food drives, and family outreach events. She had never asked for recognition. She had simply been there, quietly helping where she was needed. Near the back of the final binder, a folded appointment card slipped onto my desk. It listed a date only 3 days before my mother's passing, and the address of Lincoln Elementary. On the back, written in my mother's unmistakable handwriting, were 7 simple words that stopped me cold. "If anything happens, Trust Evelyn before anyone else. I read the sentence again, then again. The room suddenly felt far too quiet. Somewhere between those faded letters and the old photograph, the version of my past that I had defended for 8 years had begun to collapse. And for the first time, I realized that discovering the truth might cost me far more than believing the lie ever had. The sentence my mother left behind refused to leave my mind. I had read it so many times that every letter seemed carved into the inside of my thoughts. If anything happens, trust Evelyn before anyone else. My mother had never wasted words. She believed promises were valuable because they were rare. If she had written that message only days before her passing, then she had known something I never did. The realization settled over me like a storm moving in without warning. For years, I had convinced myself that certainty was strength. Now I understood that certainty built on incomplete truth was only another form of blindness. I spent the next morning inside the archives of our family foundation, asking for every volunteer record, every meeting schedule, and every handwritten note connected to my mother's final year. The employees looked surprised to see me searching through old storage cabinets instead of reviewing financial reports. I ignored their curious glances. Dust-covered boxes that had not been opened in years. Inside were faded calendars, attendance sheets, thank you letters, and photographs from community events. Evelyn appeared again and again, never standing in the center, never seeking recognition, always helping quietly beside my mother. In one photograph, she organized books for children. In another, she served meals during a holiday fundraiser. In every image, my mother looked genuinely happy standing beside her. I wondered how I had forgotten an entire chapter of the woman I claimed to know better than anyone. Anthony joined me just before noon, carrying another storage box that had recently been discovered in a locked filing room scheduled for renovation. "This belonged to your mother's private office," he explained. "Nobody touched it after she passed away, because we believed everything important had already been removed." I carefully lifted the lid. Inside rested several journals, carefully labeled folders, and a small wooden keepsake box. The journals contained personal reflections about charity projects, families my mother had helped, and dreams she hoped the foundation would continue long after she was gone. Evelyn's name appeared frequently, always accompanied by words like dependable, compassionate, patient, and courageous. Not once did my mother express doubt. Not once did she hint that Evelyn had betrayed anyone. Then I opened the wooden box. Resting inside was another silver family brooch, nearly identical to the one in the old photograph except for a tiny engraving on the back. I turned it over beneath the desk lamp. 4 simple words had been etched into the metal. For Evelyn, with trust. My chest tightened. Family heirlooms were never duplicated without purpose. My mother had intentionally prepared one for Evelyn. That decision alone shattered years of assumptions. Anthony quietly broke the silence. "Marcus, there is something I never understood back then." I looked toward him. "The week before your mother passed away, she asked me to arrange a private meeting room for her and Evelyn. She specifically instructed me not to interrupt them, no matter how long they stayed inside. Did anyone else know?" I asked. Anthony slowly nodded. "One person insisted on attending before your mother arrived. He claimed he needed to discuss foundation finances." My heartbeat quickened. "Who?" Anthony answered without hesitation. "Richard Bennett, your mother's legal advisor." The name struck me harder than I expected. Richard had remained beside our family for decades. He handled legal documents, estate planning, charitable agreements, and confidential records. After my mother died, he had also been the first person to tell me that Evelyn could no longer be trusted. At the time, I accepted every word, because grief had left me desperate for certainty. Now another possibility quietly emerged, one I had never considered before. What if the man who explained the truth to me had actually decided which version of the truth I would hear? As I looked once more at the engraved brooch resting in my hand, I realized my search was no longer about finding Evelyn. It had become about discovering who had benefited the most from making me believe she had disappeared with betrayal instead of sacrifice. The first person I called the next morning was not a lawyer, an executive, or a member of my security team. It was Daniel Harper. He answered after the second ring, his calm voice carrying the same quiet patience I had heard inside the school hallway. "I was wondering when you would call," he said. I looked out across the city from my office window before speaking. "You knew this would happen." He remained silent for a moment. "No," he answered honestly. "I only hoped you would finally start asking the questions you should have asked years ago." His words stayed with me long after the call ended. Questions. That was exactly what I had avoided for 8 years. I had accepted explanations because they matched my pain. I never tested whether they matched the truth. Before noon, I asked Anthony to arrange a private meeting with Richard Bennett at my office. I gave no explanation. I simply told him I wanted every document connected to my mother's estate, the family foundation, and the final 6 months before her passing. Anthony looked at me carefully before nodding. He understood that something fundamental had changed. By early afternoon, Richard entered my office carrying several organized binders beneath one arm. He looked exactly as he always had: perfectly tailored gray suit, polished shoes, calm smile. The appearance of a man who believed preparation could solve every problem. "Marcus," he greeted warmly. "Anthony mentioned you wanted to review some historical records." I was surprised by the request. I invited him to sit across from my desk. The old photograph remained inside the envelope beside my notebook, hidden from view. "I have been thinking about my mother's final months," I began. "There are details I never fully understood." Richard folded his hands together comfortably. "Grief makes many memories difficult to organize. That is perfectly natural. Years ago, those words would have reassured me. Today they sounded carefully rehearsed." I opened one of the estate binders and slowly turned the pages. Every signature appeared exactly where it belonged. Every legal document seemed complete. Then I noticed something unexpected. Several appointment logs referenced meetings that no supporting notes described. The dates matched the same weeks my mother had frequently visited Lincoln Elementary. "These meetings?" I asked quietly. "Why are there no summaries?" Richard barely glanced at the pages. "Some conversations were personal. Your mother requested privacy." I nodded slowly. "Did those meetings involve Evelyn?" For the first time since entering the room, Richard hesitated. The pause lasted less than a second, but it was there. "Occasionally," he answered. "She volunteered with the foundation." I studied his expression. "That sounds different from what you told me years ago." Richard leaned back in his chair. "People remember events differently after time passes." I reached into my desk and carefully placed the old photograph on the polished wood between us. His eyes immediately settled on it. His composed expression remained, but something behind it shifted almost invisibly. Recognition arrived before surprise. That single moment told me more than any explanation could have. "You have seen this before," I said quietly. Richard looked back toward me. "I may have." "Do not guess," I replied. "Tell me the truth." He remained silent. I slid the engraved brooch beside the photograph. My mother trusted Evelyn enough to give her this. She left written instructions telling me to trust my wife above everyone else. Yet after my mother passed away, you convinced me Evelyn had betrayed our family. Help me understand how those two things can exist at the same time. Richard slowly removed his glasses and placed them on the table. The confidence that had always surrounded him seemed noticeably smaller now. He looked at the photograph for several long seconds before quietly speaking. "Marcus, there are conversations that were never supposed to reach you until much later." My heartbeat remained steady. For the first time in years, I was not afraid of the answer. I was only afraid of how many more years of my life had been built upon a story that someone else had carefully written for me. Richard's words lingered in the silence long after he stopped speaking. I studied his face, searching for the confidence that had always defined him, but it had been replaced by something far less certain. He folded his hands together and lowered his eyes toward the old photograph resting between us. "Your mother believed the truth could become dangerous before the right time," he said quietly. "She asked several people to protect certain pieces of it until she believed you were ready." I shook my head slowly. "That does not explain why I spent 8 years believing my wife betrayed us." Richard closed his eyes for a brief moment before answering. "Because Evelyn asked us to let you believe it." The room became impossibly still. Even the distant sounds of traffic beyond the glass windows seemed to disappear. I stared at him, convinced I had misunderstood. "She asked you to destroy her own reputation." Richard nodded. "She insisted that if circumstances forced someone to carry the blame, It had to be her. She believed you would survive anger more easily than fear. I leaned back in my chair, unable to speak. Every memory I had protected suddenly demanded to be questioned again. Richard carefully opened one of the binders and removed a sealed envelope with my mother's handwriting across the front. It was addressed only to him. He slid a single folded page toward me. "She instructed me never to give you the original," he explained, "but she allowed me to show you one paragraph. If the day ever came when you began searching on your own." I unfolded the copy with trembling hands. The words were unmistakably my mother's. She wrote that Evelyn possessed remarkable courage, that she had volunteered to protect matters that should never become public during a period of uncertainty, and that no one should mistake silence for guilt. She ended the paragraph with one sentence that struck harder than anything else. She wrote that the greatest burden would not belong to the person keeping the secret, but to the person forced to judge without knowing it existed. I lowered the page onto my desk. For years, I had believed I was the victim of betrayal. Now I could no longer ignore another possibility. Perhaps Evelyn had been the one carrying the impossible burden while I unknowingly added to it. "Where is she?" I asked quietly. Richard hesitated again. This time his hesitation felt different. It was no longer defensive, it was careful. "I did not know for several years," he admitted. "She never contacted me directly after leaving. Everything came through trusted intermediaries, because she wanted no attention drawn toward your family." Anthony looked toward him with genuine surprise. "You mean she never disappeared to escape us?" Richard slowly shook his head. "No, she disappeared to protect a promise she made." I stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city. Countless lives continued below, each person carrying stories invisible to everyone around them. I wondered how many times Evelyn had walked through crowds feeling equally unseen, while I convinced myself she had abandoned everything we built together. "Can you find her now?" I asked without turning around. Richard answered after a long pause. "I believe I can." I faced him again. "Then we leave today." Richard remained seated. "Marcus, before you meet her, there is something you must understand." He pointed toward the photograph still resting on my desk. "The woman in that picture is not waiting for an apology to repair the past. She has spent 8 years building a completely different life. If you go looking for forgiveness, you may discover that forgiveness was never the hardest thing she had to give." I carefully picked up the old photograph once more. For the first time since Daniel Harper placed it in my hands, I no longer saw it as evidence. I saw it as an invitation to face the truth I had avoided for far too long, even if that truth led me to a door that might never open again. The next morning arrived with a strange kind of calm, the kind that only comes after an entire life has been turned inside out. Richard traveled with Anthony and me without saying much during the 2-hour drive north. The highways slowly gave way to quiet country roads lined with old maple trees, weathered barns, and fields glowing beneath the soft autumn sun. According to Richard, Evelyn had settled in a small lakeside town several years earlier, choosing a place where nobody recognized the Callahan name or cared about the fortune attached to it. She had built a simple life, one measured by ordinary mornings instead of extraordinary headlines. As the miles disappeared beneath the tires, I realized I had spent 8 years imagining where she might have gone, without ever imagining who she had become. We finally reached a peaceful neighborhood where modest homes overlooked a quiet lake reflecting the pale blue sky. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks while neighbors greeted one another by name. Nothing about the place resembled the world I had spent years controlling. Richard pointed toward a white cottage with a small front porch decorated with flower pots and neatly trimmed roses. "She is there," he said softly. My hands remained still on my knees. For the first time in years, I found myself afraid of opening a door. Anthony placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, before remaining behind with Richard, allowing me to walk the final steps alone. Every footstep across the stone pathway seemed heavier than the last. Before I reached the porch, the front door slowly opened. Evelyn stood quietly beneath the morning light, wearing a simple cream sweater and blue jeans, her hair gently moving with the breeze from the lake. Time had changed both of us, but her eyes were exactly as I remembered them. Calm, honest, kind. She looked at me without surprise, almost as though she had always believed this day would eventually arrive. Neither of us spoke for several long seconds. The silence no longer felt like punishment. It felt like respect, for everything words could never fully explain. "Hello, Marcus," she finally said with a gentle smile that carried more peace than sadness. Hearing my name in her voice again loosened something inside me that I had held tightly for years. "You knew I would come," I whispered. She nodded slightly. "Daniel called yesterday evening. He told me you had finally seen the photograph." I lowered my eyes for a moment before looking back at her. "I should have asked you what happened 8 years ago." Evelyn's expression remained gentle. "Yes," she answered quietly. "You should have." There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness, only simple truth. That made the weight of my mistake even greater. I reached into my coat and carefully removed the old photograph along with the silver brooch my mother had engraved for her. Evelyn's eyes softened the moment she saw them. She accepted the brooch with both hands, running her fingers across the engraved words as though greeting an old friend. "Your mother believed kindness could outlive fear," she said softly. "She wanted this family to be remembered for compassion before power." I felt my throat tighten. "Why did you never tell me the truth?" She looked toward the peaceful lake shimmering beyond the yard before answering. "Because I gave your mother my word. She believed some promises were worth carrying, even when they broke your heart. I chose to keep mine." Tears threatened for the first time in many years. Not because I had found Evelyn, but because I finally understood the price she had quietly paid. Standing together beneath the warm morning sunlight, with the old photograph resting between us once again, I realized that the missing pieces of our past had finally come together, and the truth my mother had protected for so long was no longer hidden by silence, but illuminated by the courage of the woman I had spent 8 years misunderstanding. When I left the cottage that evening, the old photograph rested inside my jacket once again, but it no longer felt like evidence from a forgotten past. It had become a promise for the future. Evelyn did not ask me to stay. She did not ask for explanations that should have come years earlier. She simply thanked me for finally listening. Somehow, that quiet grace carried more weight than any words of forgiveness ever could. I returned to the city with Anthony and Richard in complete silence. The skyline that had once filled me with pride now reminded me how easily success could hide failure. I had built businesses, protected a legacy, and earned respect from countless people. Yet I had failed to do the one thing my mother believed mattered most. I had failed to trust someone worthy of it. The following week became unlike any other in my life. Instead of expanding investments or attending exclusive meetings, I reopened every charitable project my mother had started. I personally visited the community center where the old photograph had been taken. I walked through Lincoln Elementary and thanked Daniel Harper for protecting the truth until I was finally willing to face it. He smiled with the same quiet patience that had first unsettled me, and simply said that the truth never disappears. It only waits for someone brave enough to accept it. Richard gathered our extended family and the foundation board for a private meeting. One by one, every remaining document connected to my mother's final wishes was carefully reviewed. There were no shocking conspiracies waiting inside the files, only a series of thoughtful decisions designed to protect vulnerable people during a difficult season of uncertainty. The greatest misunderstanding had never been created by a single lie. It had grown from unanswered questions, painful assumptions, and my own refusal to look beyond the story that seemed easiest to believe. I stood before everyone and admitted that I had judged Evelyn without giving her the opportunity to speak. Those words were the hardest I had ever spoken, yet they also felt strangely freeing. Nobody interrupted. Nobody celebrated. They simply accepted that honesty had finally entered a room where certainty had lived for far too long. Several days later, I drove back to the lakeside town alone. Evelyn was planting fresh flowers beside the porch when she looked up and saw me walking through the gate. This time, neither of us carried the weight of unfinished questions. We spent the afternoon talking about ordinary things that had been missing from our lives for years. We spoke about books my mother loved, children she had encouraged through the reading program, quiet mornings beside the lake, and the simple comfort of living without fear. There was no attempt to erase the past, because neither of us could. Instead, we chose to build something honest upon it. Before sunset, I handed Evelyn a newly framed copy of the old photograph. Beside it, I placed the silver brooch my mother had engraved, with 4 simple words, that had quietly survived every misunderstanding. Evelyn smiled through grateful tears and carefully placed both inside the living room above the fireplace, where the evening light gently touched the glass. I realized then that my mother had never intended the photograph to preserve a memory. She wanted it to preserve a lesson. Power can protect a reputation. Wealth can build remarkable buildings. Influence can open almost any door. But none of those things can replace the courage to trust the people who have already proven their loyalty through quiet acts of kindness. As the last light disappeared across the peaceful lake, I finally understood that the strongest families are not held together by fear, authority, or tradition. They endure because someone chooses compassion when suspicion seems easier, and because the truth, no matter how long it waits, always finds its way home.